Hey everybody, John the Other here, obviously. There is, in Canada and at Canadian universities, a sex panic, which claims that Canadian culture in general and universities in particular are in the midst of a decades-long epidemic of sexual violence by male students against female students. You can roll your eyes at that if you want to. That the reported incidence of criminal sexual victimization has been constantly dropping for the last 20 years is proof, we are told, not of a diminishing rate of sexual violence, but is claimed to indicate a rising problem of underreporting by victims due to the sinister and mysterious forces of patriarchy and hegemonic toxic masculinity. And to effectively combat this invisible crime wave that sinister male-centric statistical data would mislead you into believing does not exist, universities have developed policies to protect female students from the very dangerous and elusive and yet very numerous but also invisible male sexual predators on campus. Under pressure from student activist groups, several provinces, including BC, have passed laws requiring post-secondary institutions to create official sexual misconduct policies, and these policies create a pseudo-court system within each university, each with its own rules, procedures, and assumptions, and each taking on the role of a court, but without the messy and inconvenient restraints of English common law, which is where our actual courts get things like presumption of innocence, the right to confront an accusation with evidence, the right to know what you're accused of, limits on treading on your civil rights, and so on. There is a student group called Our Turn, which began at Carleton University in Ottawa, who have produced a best practices policy manual which has been adopted and endorsed by the student unions of more than 20 other Canadian universities. The title is A National Student-Led Action Plan to End Campus Sexual Violence. And nobody could possibly object to such a noble goal unless they were in favor of increasing the sexual victimization of women, and certainly anybody who pointed out that the incidence of sexual assault and rape has been persistently dropping every single year for over 20 years would obviously be a person who hates women. The first action item in the Our Turn National Plan reads as follows: pass a motion acknowledging the existence of and committing to eliminating rape culture on their campus. That's the first action item. Don't question the claim. Don't consider evidence. No, instead pass a motion acknowledging the existence of an imaginary criminal epidemic so that it cannot be questioned by any individual without running afoul of whatever policies flow out of that political resolution. In fact, if you pointed out that colleges and universities were just about the safest places in an already very safe country, you would probably deserve to have all of your civil rights erased, because pointing out observable facts is the act of a would-be rapist. Obviously. But to keep this discussion relatively short, I'm going to focus on one of the university sexual misconduct policies that the Our Turn Action Plan takes as a model to be emulated by and enlarged on by other universities. UBC, University of British Columbia's Policy 131, is the second highest rated university sexual assault policy in Canada by the Our Turn organization, after Ryerson University. And it is UBC's Policy 131 definition of the term sexual misconduct that the Our Turn National Plan takes as their own definition from page 12 of the Our Turn Policy Manual. For the purpose of the Our Turn National Action Plan, we adopt the definition of sexual violence from the University of British Columbia, UBC, Sexual Assault and Other Misconduct Policy, which defines sexual misconduct as, quote, any sexual act or act targeting an individual's sexuality, gender identity, or gender expression, whether the act is physical or psychological in nature, that is committed, threatened, or attempted against an individual without that individual's consent. And this should not be missed. The UBC policy definition is for the term sexual misconduct, giving a definition so broad and so all-encompassing that almost any activity, whether it's sexual or not, or any utterance, sexual or not, could be encompassed and swept up in UBC's policy definition of the term sexual misconduct. But the National Action Plan, borrowing this already too broad definition, instead calls it a definition for, quote, sexual violence. And why does this matter if you're not in a university? Well, that's quite simple. The RTURN Student Action Plan's actual plan isn't just to eliminate an imaginary campus crime wave. The plan is to create a new and an improved court system in the sandbox of the university campus, and then demonstrate how great it is by getting a 95 or a 99% conviction rate in the Kangaroo court of the college tribunal, and then use that sandbox model to replace the actual law courts where criminal cases are tried without the very inconvenient to prosecutors habits of an accused person's basic civil rights. But because I'm not a lawyer, I asked for some help in finding some of the problems in UBC's policy, and I got a few notes back from my very close friend, who I will call the amazing Mr. G, who is an experienced criminal lawyer as well as the most learned person that I know. So here are his notes. First off, the terminology used in UBC's Policy 131 is extremely vague as well as being very confusing. For example, the policy constantly and confusingly switches between legal jargon and social justice jargon, but makes no distinction between the two anywhere in the document. Possibly the most important phrase in UBC's policy manual is the term sexual misconduct, as that term is the overt reason for the entire policy's existence, being called Policy 131 Sexual Assault and Other Sexual Misconduct. Sexual assault, which has a definition in the Canadian Criminal Code, is redefined by this policy to be broader than the Criminal Code's definition, which leads us to a natural question. How is it that our legislatures and our courts and our police are allowing educational institutions to take over the job of the courts and the police? I don't know the answer to that, so we're going to ignore that question, just like the courts and the police and the legislatures are already ignoring it, and we will move on to the associated definition of sexual misconduct. Here's what my lawyer friend says about the definition of sexual misconduct in UBC's policy. The definition is so large and so all-encompassing as to potentially include thousands of innocent and unintentional acts and non-acts. I'll read you the text of the policy's definition for the term sexual misconduct. Sexual misconduct is any act or sexual act targeting an individual's sexuality, their gender identity, or their gender expression, whether that act is physical or psychological in nature, that is committed, threatened, or attempted, etc., blah, blah, blah. Now, there's more to the definition. It goes on and on. But the additional details of that definition broaden the definition rather than narrow it. Rather than limiting what I've just read to you, it expands it, which is a very strange thing for a long definition to do. So I'm going to leave a link to that policy if you want to go read it, and we will only break down the first part that I just read. Sexual misconduct is any sexual act or act targeting an individual's sexuality, gender identity, or gender expression, whether the act is physical or psychological in nature, whether the act is sexual or not, and whether the act is physical or a psychological act, which means it's an act which includes the act of thought. So we now have thought crime encompassed in the definition of sexual misconduct in UBC's sexual assault policy. And it's also whether the act, whether physical or not, and whether sexual or not, is one that, in the language of the definition, targets the recipient's sexual identity, their sexuality, or their gender expression. Now, the word targets might be appropriate if the targeting behavior was more clearly defined as hostile or aggressive, but in this definition, the word target serves only to inflame uncontroversial behavior and speech with an undeserved patina of aggression that in almost all cases is unwarranted. So there is no behavior, really, or lack of behavior that could not reasonably be scooped up in this all-encompassing definition of so-called sexual misconduct. And this is a policy at a university which will be interpreted by the believers of the prevailing university's social justice, everything is rape ideology. The next note. He says, the tone of this policy also assumes guilt on the part of the respondent, which is a reversal of Section 11 of the Canadian Charter. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Canadian Charter, Section 11D in specific reads, Any person charged with an offense has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty according to law in a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. And this, by the way, is the legacy of English common law, which the promoters of projects like Our Turn would like to sweep entirely off the table. Policy 131 also advocates what is called a, quote, trauma-informed approach. Now I'll read you section 1.4 of the policy's principles and commitments. It states, UBC is committed to reducing barriers to disclosing and reporting and taking a trauma-informed approach when responding to and addressing disclosure and reports and conducting investigations. So what does that mean? Well, the phrase trauma-informed approach is a recently popularized bit of pseudoscience, claiming that nobody can understand the behavior of a victim unless they first understand the function of the amygdala as an information gatekeeper in the brain. At least, that was the story by the people promoting trauma-informed investigation until last year, when the popularizers of this pseudoscience were confronted by new neuroscience telling them that they were completely wrong. And then their explanation became, don't worry your pretty little head about the details, we are still right. The math we did is wrong, but the answer is right. The trauma-informed approach is actually just new jargon to repackage the memory recovery techniques used by charlatans in the 1980s to criminally charge and to falsely convict thousands of daycare workers for an imaginary satanic ritual abuse panic that occurred back in the 80s, which sent hundreds of innocent people to jail and ruined thousands of lives of individuals and families. So that is what is now being called the, quote, trauma-informed approach, but I guess it's okay to reuse the same debunked fraud from the 80s so long as you've got some shiny new scientific language to describe it, right? And before I go any further, the litany of crimes, it's worth noting that in the raft of civil rights abuses contained in UBC's policy, there is in fact one positive point. UBC's sexual assault tribunals used to use the student and the faculty panel members to adjudicate and investigate claims of abuse. That is to say, when you were accused of some sort of misconduct, they used students and staff who, outside the context of that particular tribunal, lived and worked in the very intoxicating Kool-Aid of the imaginary campus sex panic. But what UBC has done, to their credit, is to stop using students and staff as inquisitors and to bring in third-party legal consultants to conduct their hearings. I am also pleased, by the way, to report that the last time Lighthouse had a client facing a UBC misconduct tribunal, the student was acquitted of their complaint by the extremely competent and professional third-party lawyer who was hired by the university to conduct that tribunal. It remains that universities should not be in the business of pretending to be the police or courts, but I point this out to note that the situation is not completely hopeless. I also mention this knowing that I may be, in fact, alerting the campus activists to particular flaws in their plan to produce a climate of 100% finding of guilt, no matter how frivolous the accusation is. Unfortunately, I will have to risk that to tell you that good news. The correct answer, though, is not to have a lawyer run your kangaroo court, but to get out of the business of pretending that a university can have its own laws or its own courts at all. Also, if you have a male family member attending a university, they are in a hostile environment, particularly if they imagine that they have conventional civil rights which will be respected. At present, it appears they will not. But documenting the violations by universities of student civil rights has a purpose beyond just fostering justifiable anger from the public. The universities have gone along with the erosion of their student civil rights because they are regularly being sued by well-funded grievance activist groups who want to use the university as a money pump for their salaried activism, as well as creating a sandbox legal system which will create their desired 100% rate of conviction for complaints. And with that presumed 100% success rate, then push their brave new system into the actual and proper criminal courts. And in my opinion, the only way the universities are going to steer away from creating their perfect 100% conviction rate and then migrating that to our actual legal courts is that they begin to be sued for destroying the careers and the lives of students in their most dubious kangaroo courts. And making that happen is not going to be quick or easy, but you can help in a number of different ways, including by donating to Lighthouse through Patreon or PayPal, Links to that in the video description. Lighthouse, by the way, for those who don't know, is a Canadian non-profit organization with the purpose of helping to protect the rights of the falsely accused. Thanks very much for watching, as always, and have a lovely day.